So let's say you're reading an article on climate change. That article explains that this year ice has actually grown in the polar regions. And that's actually very significant because in 2012 we experienced record ice melt. So it should be no surprise that how you interpret this information is going to be biased based on whether or not you believe in climate change or not, and whether or not you think climate change is man-made. But what might surprise you is that how you interpret this information might also be affected by your own self-concept, how you think about yourself, your own self-identity. So currently, it seems that the ice cap on the North Pole is actually 60% larger this year than it was last year. And this is important information, but how are media outlets reporting this news? And how is that affecting the consumer? Certainly, it's often pointed out that information like this isn't really proof of long-term phenomenon. For instance, in 2012, we had the hottest year on record, and that doesn't prove global warming. Likewise, growth in the polar ice caps doesn't disprove global warming. But all of the articles I found so far give you just a little bit of information about it, explain how it calls into question the argument of man-made climate change. And then they go on into how is this going to affect the debate. So what they're giving you is just a little bit of science and then teasing you with the controversy to draw you in. You become clickbait. You are traffic for the website to prove to advertisers that their products are being marketed to you. So unsurprisingly, Pepsi has managed to produce research that proves people prefer Pepsi over Coke. But of course, scientists have reproduced this research many times and find that people are unreliable in even telling the difference between the two brands. fMRI studies are starting to come out that investigate how people interact with brands. One of these had people in there where they had preference for brand A over brand B, let's just say Pepsi and Coke. So if they preferred Pepsi, they were given Coke, but told it was Pepsi. As they tasted it, they confirmed to the experimenters that, yes, I am definitely drinking Pepsi. The fMRI showed that when they drank the Pepsi, which indeed was Coke, the pleasure centers of their brain started to light up. They were getting a reward. They were getting something that they like. But when the experimenters told them that they had been deceived, they had actually imbibed the dreaded Coke. Not only did the pleasure centers fall dark, but the parts of their brain involved with their self-identity, their self-concept, started to shoot off alarms. Apparently, when we take a brand and we make it our own, we really make it our own. It embeds itself into our self-concept. So every time you buy the brand that you always buy, and you might have all kinds of reasons why this one is better than the other, you're really just affirming your own choices, your own self-identity. The choices you've made in the past are now validated because you're making them again in the future. So if something this dramatic can be present in something that's really as inconsequential as which fabric softener you use, it shouldn't be a stretch to assume that it also happens with your politically charged scientific beliefs. To draw an analogy between this and climate change, as ice melts, it forms a feedback loop. Less sea ice means less white reflective substance on the Earth, and so the Earth absorbs more heat, thus more ice melt. As sea ice melts, it releases trapped greenhouse gases, so the Earth retains more of the solar heat. And ice melts at a rate that is inversely proportional to its surface area, so the more it melts, the quicker it melts. Similarly, cheap content fuels a person's previously held beliefs. At the same time, it provides the content provider with ad revenue. And this incentivizes the content producer to report about the debate instead of actually informing the consumer. And as we saw with choosing a brand of soda, they'd probably just rather have their convictions confirmed anyway, rather than actually being educated and informed by the content. So previously held convictions confirmed, the emboldened consumer is now polarized enough to go out and reject any conflicting evidence that caused them to reevaluate their beliefs, which leaves them with no choice but to keep returning to the same sources that will eagerly accept their viewership, and thus a feedback loop. If the writers of these articles were actually trying to inform and educate, they could have easily added in enough information to show the complexity of this situation. The National Snow and Ice Center tracks daily ice melt. But while I was researching this video, ironically their website was down due to flooding caused by severe storms. So while searching for data, I managed to stumble upon this guy's blog post that is just a perfect example of horrible science. In this post he argues that ice caps aren't shrinking. In fact, they might even be growing. And he provides two bits of evidence. The first you can ignore outright. He takes current satellite data and he overlays that on a 42-year-old map from National Geographic's. Now, this map is the kind that you would find folded up in your first issue as a thanks for subscribing. And it contains factoids, and there's probably a lot of arbitrariness to how they actually drew the ice caps. Because there's no landmass underneath it. It fluctuates every year. Now, this is reckless, but the second bit of data is worse than reckless. He has here these two graphs of data that seem to show conflicting information. The first has a clear trend towards melting, and the second seems to show a lot of fluctuation over a relatively steady average. The problem with comparing these two graphs is they're in different formats. The first is a line graph, and this reports the overall size of the ice caps. But the second one is a histogram, and it reports monthly changes to the ice cap. So while you can't directly compare these two graphs, you can use data from one to infer information in the other. And if you look at the data in the second, the rate of melting clearly supports the change in mass of the first graph. So before this Arctic story broke, it was well known that ice in the Antarctic was actually growing in isolated areas. And there are many theories for why this might be happening, and likely the explanation is a combination of all of them, plus some we haven't even thought of yet. One of them involves wind. Now, wind temperature and patterns are dictated by the jet stream, and the jet stream is largely affected by the temperatures of the ocean currents. So if melting ice is affecting the temperature of the ocean currents, then that's going to affect the jet stream, which is going to affect the temperature and patterns of winds. So that cool wind can actually come in and cause ice formation in a certain area, and of course the inverse is possible too. Another theory involves desalination. So the ice sheets are made of frozen water, not frozen salt water. So as they melt, they desalinate the water around them. Ocean currents can take this desalinated water to other regions, and depending on the conditions there, it can actually lead to ice growth. You could also look at so many other factors like the polar vortex, which affects wind temperatures and ocean currents. And we experienced a record-breaking polar vortex in the winter of 2012-13. But I'll spare you on that because the point of this is a content producer could have easily given you enough information to show you how complex a system like a climate could be, if their goal is actually to inform you and not just attract traffic with cheap content. But finally, I would like to say that I think the debate on global climate change is oversimplified and misdirected. Really, all we have is a cacophony of certainty and uncertainty and good science and bad science all delivered through terrible media. When distilled, the subject ought to come down to a hierarchy of scientific question. And if it turns out we have no concerns, great. But clearly we can never have no concerns until we rule out the concerns we have. But I fear that because we have a media that would rather procure traffic than develop insight, whether you believe in climate change or not depends a lot less on the science and a lot more on which Memorial Day sales commercials you watch and which diet plan banners on the websites you click on.